Now, I first encountered insider dealing as a police officer, actually, in an old police story. And the insider in this case was actually inside Wandsworth Prison. And the surveillance team followed an individual to that meeting. And it's very difficult to sit next to a prisoner in a prison meeting room and eavesdrop on a conversation. In fact, it's not possible because you haven't booked a visit, so you can't get into the prison even though you're the police. But this was many, many years ago, before mobile telephones, and upon leaving the prison, the target of the surveillance went straight to a telephone box. And fortunately for the team, it was the old-fashioned telephone boxes where one was stood next to another. So a member of the surveillance team quickly followed and pretended to make a call and listened to what this man had to say about the meeting he just had with a very top-level criminal in prison. And what he said was, you need to get £10,000 on Dave's donkey in the 315 at Doncaster over 20 different betting offices and take a price of 20 to 1. So what did the surveillance team do? They went to the cash till, right? And they got as much money as they possibly could on Dave's donkey at 20 to 1, and it won. It was a great day at the office. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was my first introduction to insider trading, insider dealing. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is a bit different, really, because of my background. I am a former police officer. I'm also a former money laundering reporting officer for 3 different investment banks. And I've submitted a number of SARs, including SARs, in relation to my suspicion or concern that the activity potentially related to insider dealing or market abuse. But when I bring all this together, I'm a financial crime officer, so I also have in mind the Fraud Act. I have in mind corruption, bribery. I have in mind cartel practices. And I have in mind for the future the Dodd-Frank Act, the new Wall Street Financial Reform Bill that will provide substantial incentives to people to blow the whistle on all kinds of financial crime, including market abuse. And it is a piece of US legislation with severe and extreme extraterritoriality. It will impact upon all transactions related to US-denominated securities, all US publicly traded companies, and therefore it have considerable reach and impact into London. And it's something you need to be aware of, because if you take Paul's introduction about statistics, and mine will give you a different view again, insider dealing is happening out there, and people are aware of it. And similar to, in many ways, bribery and corruption, there is ordinarily more than one participant in the insider dealing. And therefore, there is the communication. And many, many years ago, armies and generals were at their most vulnerable on communication. Communication is where the authorities seek to intercept the communication and use that as the evidence. And I'll talk more about that in the future of this presentation. But you have to be aware of it. Your staff have to be aware of it. You have to change some of your thinking and your training. You have to change, as an example, your whistleblowing policies, because really you need to know about it before the authorities do. But when the authorities are offering rewards of up to 30%, and they'll only pick up a case that has a value of in excess of $1 million, it's difficult to see how you incentivize your staff to talk to you internally first before engaging with a lawyer in the US and going straight to the SEC. So think about it in that context as I go through this. So my idea is the laundering of the proceeds of the market abuse, not necessarily the market abuse itself. And I first presented this in Australia in 2009. Well, it was a choice. It was Altrincham or Australia. And I went heads, tails, so I went to Australia and did it. And not a lot's changed, save for some of the new legislation I referred to. But particularly, as we look at this, and I'm just whizzing through some to the contents, we look at the crime. In money laundering, there are not that many, if any at all, typologies of drug traffickers using wholesale markets to launder the proceeds of their crimes. Drugs is a cash business. You can't buy your drugs using a cheque. That is not based upon my experience as a former addict, more based upon my experience as a former drug squad officer. The cheque will bounce, or the person you're dealing with does not really want to create an audit trail between himself and his customers. So it's a cash business. And you may have seen from your own money laundering trading slides pictures published by the Drug Enforcement Agency of $230 million in cash in a room in Mexico. So it isn't just street dealing level. The whole drug business is a cash business. Robbery, you normally rob for cash. Tax is a bit different, we'll come to that later on, but you don't see many typologies of what we call common criminality using wholesale markets, using simple and even complicated financial products to launder the proceeds of crime. Where they come into play is when the predicate fiscal crime is in fact market abuse, or an abuse of the markets, or an abuse of position, a fraud in relation to shares or bonds, and those proceeds are subsequently laundered in the markets. So let's look at some of the cases. That's a rotten apple, as I'm sure you can see, and I'm just going to read this one because I don't do it justice. April 24th, 2007, the SEC announced it would not take action against Apple and Steve Jobs, but charges were filed against the Chief Financial Officer Fred Anderson and the former Apple General Counsel Nancy Hynan for alleged roles in backdating Apple share options. Anderson immediately settled the charges and paid $150,000 as disgorgement of ill-gotten gains and approximately $3.5 million in fines and other settlements. Nancy Hynan eventually settled. So what you have, and what was taking place at that time, was the senior executives of Forbes 500 companies backdating their share options. It was, if you will, it wasn't back to the future, it was a future back to now. So when the price had gone up, if you could actually move the dating of your option further back to generate yet more money for the exercising of your options, you did that. But the question being therefore, when you're gaining, who's losing? And of course, the shareholders were losing. And those sales of those shares were exercised through brokerages, through investment banks. What access you have to the information about what's taking place, I think you struggle with that. I think a lot of this, what we have to be in this business, is we're reactionary to what's published by newspapers, television, and what's published by prosecutors and regulators when they take action. We look and see where we are at all contaminated by any of that took place, where we engaged in business at that time with any of these people. What was the share price? I work for clients quite a bit in Mayfair right now with hedge funds and high net worth individuals, and I'm forever using Bloomberg tracking prices of shares going back 3 years to see where was the share price at that time and why did we do what we did, why did the other people do what they did, what did they potentially know. So the information is available to you to use, the information is equally available to regulators and law enforcement to use. Market timing. This, again, is better served if I read, but market timing is a market abuse. It involves a rapid trading of mutual funds shares to take advantage of the inefficiencies in mutual fund pricing. Mutual funds are priced once a day, so they're not immediately affected by the price movements of the shares in their portfolio or their baskets. Beginning in December 1998, Waddell & Reed entered into written agreements that allowed 3 investors to engage in short-term trading in return for a fee. So the brokerage is taking a fee to facilitate this business. Waddell & Reed entered into market timing arrangements even though the firm knew that the timing could have a harmful effect on the funds and their long-term investors. In particular, Waddell & Reed marketed the International Growth Fund as a long-term investment for the general public, but then allowed short-term market timers to skim profits from long-term investors. In total, Waddell & Reed was paid approximately $3.6 million by the market timers. That's a market abuse. To give others the opportunity to abuse your customers. So you're selling on the one hand a long-term investment to retail customers, to the general public, and yet you're giving hedge funds or other funds the opportunity to short-term trade that, then you are abusing the market and you're certainly abusing your customers. Sometimes we have to look at, when we're looking at the business we're conducting with our clients, what are we doing on the one side that has an impact on the other side? So our funds sales desk who are selling our brokerage services to hedge funds and other asset managers need to be aware of what our retail arm might be doing to see if there's a clash and a conflict between the two processes. We all know Raj Ratnan right now, as it's a very, very high profile case. I wrote a paper some time ago of the sinking of HMS Galleon, and it is a case that I think will have a huge impact upon us here in the UK. In the US, there are multiple prosecutors, there are multiple investigators. The last time I gave evidence in a criminal trial as a police officer was in New York. Newcastle, New York, Newcastle, New York. I went to New York. The last time I gave evidence in a criminal case as a money laundering reporting officer was in Miami. Because the US has many, many prosecutors, it's far more aggressive. And consequently, the FBI can pick up a case against organised crime and not even alert the SEC that they're undertaking an investigation into insider trading. The same would not apply in the UK for many, many reasons, but insider trading is the bailiwick of the FSA, and there isn't a police service, as they're now called, police force as they used to be called when I was a police officer, in the UK who has the experience or the expertise, the wherewithal, or critically, the budget or the will to take on an insider trading case. So if I'm an organised criminal engaged in insider trading, am I going to do it in New York or London? I'm coming to London. It's a much safer environment for me to operate as a criminal. In the US, as I say, the FBI can do it. The Manhattan District Attorney can and has done it. So he's a state prosecutor, not a federal prosecutor. Is it a competitive environment? Yes, it can be. A lot of law enforcement is competitive in that sense. But of course, as soon as the FBI take action, the SEC will become involved. Now, what I want to do with Raj is just read you some text again to give you a flavour of a couple of things, including SIM cards. Now, we all had a very nice breakfast this morning, but there came a time in this case, the Galleon case, when for breakfast some people were actually eating SIM cards. And here's where it starts. And this is from the prosecutor. The defendants behaved like common criminals who took a page from the drug dealer's handbook. That's important to remember at time, ladies and gents, because whilst we are dealing with some very sophisticated, very intelligent people, where they come unstuck is quite simply, it is one of the 7 deadly sins, it's greed. And they see opportunities to make yet more money. Now, I work for several billionaires. My office is in Mayfair, and I advise billionaires. And their definition of happiness doesn't ordinarily meet with mine. You know, one of my clients has said to him, yes, we're both driven, but we're driving different vehicles at different speeds in different directions, and I don't want to get into your car. The guy hasn't got enough money, and he never will have, because he's in a competitive environment where his counterparts, his peers, the people he engages with socially are billionaires, and he wants to have more than them. He wants to stand head and shoulders above them. So Raj Rajaratnam was a very successful businessman. However, some say, you know, just because he was successful in the market, it wasn't necessarily based upon his ability to study the market. It was more based upon his ability to cultivate informants who were very well placed in, be that consultancy companies like McKinsey, or be that executives in blue chip, again, Forbes and FTSE 100, FTSE 100, Forbes 500 companies. And there was another part, what the prosecutor said about this, and it has resonance here. If you're a wealthy trader, you aren't special. In fact, to some of these police officers and to some of these investigators, you're a target. You know, I actually, when I gave evidence in New York, the defendants were a QC from Canada and a solicitor from the UK who was also a barrister, also a magistrate. And I remember interviewing him as a police officer most days in the police room, looking across the table at him. His look on his face was said to me, "You're not clever enough, officer. You'll never work this out." He pleaded guilty in the end.